This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Jamie Richards and Edward Gauvin. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, one of the two guys with PhDs talking about comics, and on this interview show I have the pleasure of talking with not one, but two people who are translators in comics, Edward Gauvin and Jamie Richards. But before I get into that conversation, I want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off at the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off the cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are more impressive than that. And as with every month, you can find for the month of May great discounts on bundles. So you can find bundles from Vertigo, DC proper, and Marvel at 50% off the cover price. But you can find a lot of other comics as well that are deeply discounted for the month of May. So you got to go to the website and find out what those specials are. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. I have a great time talking with the two translators, Edward Gauvin and Jamie Richards. Both of them have not one, but two books that have come out over the past several weeks, books that they have translated. With Edward, it is Johar Svans Paskin and also Bluch's Peplin. And then Jamie has translated 5,000 kilometers per second, which we reviewed on the Comics Alternative about a month and a half ago. And then Igor's new book from Simon & Schuster, The Ukrainian and Russian Notebooks, Life and Death Under Soviet Rule. But before we get to that conversation, I want to take the occasion to introduce to our listeners one of those conversants, and that is Edward Gauvin. And I want to do this because Edward is going to be part of a new monthly series with the Comics Alternative. So, Edward, welcome.
Hi. Thanks so much, Derek. I'm really excited to be here and to be sharing and talking about European comics. I'm a translator by trade. I've been making a freelance living for about 10 years now. And in that time, I've done about 200 graphic novels for all sorts of publishers, from First Second, Top Shelf, and Self-Made Hero, Archaea and Boom Studios, Titan Comics, and most recently for Europe Comics, a digital-only website, and Comixology, which is hosting titles from Delcourt, a major French publisher. And you know, I've always been a comics fan, and I've had the pleasure of translating a lot of really, really great creators over the years: Frederick Peters, Marjan Satrapi, Topi, David B., Louis Trondheim, Johan Svar, Bluch, Zainab Rashed, Ludovic de Berm, Fabian Vellman, and most recently even Enki Bilal. I'm doing some retranslations of some of the classics like the Nikopol trilogy and The Hunting Party. Translating comics has been one of my main activities as a translator. I'm really happy to geek out about them here.
Yeah, but you're also an avid reader.
Absolutely. I try to keep abreast of both. It's sometimes a challenge, less so in this digital age, but sometimes a challenge keeping abreast of French comics from a distance, and keeping abreast of American ones as well. But I think it's good to have a hand in both both sides of the Atlantic and know what's going on.
Yeah. And, one of the reasons, Edward, that I wanted to have you on setting up the conversation with Jamie is, well, one, I want you to help me set up our conversation that we had with Jamie, but also I wanted to introduce you to our listeners because we do have, as you referenced, this monthly series that we're going to begin in June. And, just as we have a monthly series devoted to manga and a monthly series devoted to webcomics and then another monthly series devoted to comics for younger readers, we thought that we would do yet another monthly series, as if we don't have enough episodes on the Comics Alternative, devoted to bande dessinée or BD or European comics, however we are choosing to frame this. And it's really interesting, I think, how we met. Back in the winter, Andy Kunka and I did a review of Ludovic de Berme's Renee. And it was a couple of days after that show went up that you emailed me and you introduced yourself and you pointed out that you were the translator of Renee as well as the previous Lucille. And, as I mentioned in our conversation with Jamie, one of my problems is seeing or maybe not seeing the translators as invisible. And so when you emailed me, I thought, oh my God, you're right. I mean, he did such a wonderful job with Renee. And then you and I were going back and forth in terms of starting a correspondence. Then you and I met up at the University of Florida's Comics and Graphic Novel Conference, where both of us were keynote speakers. And we got into a conversation about the podcast and began throwing out the possibility of a monthly show on BD. And this is where we find ourselves now.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was an amazing conference, and it was such a coincidence that, I had stumbled on the Comics Alternative and that you were one of the other keynote speakers, and it was great meeting you. And I do think it was a brainchild that you had. It was born of the of our meeting down there. Yeah, and the thing is, I was actually impressed by how many. I know you always think of it as a small amount, but I was impressed by how many European, specifically French comics, French and Belgian comics you'd already covered on you and Andy on the Comics Alternative. I mean, I actually often have no idea who reads these things, so many of them don't get that many reviews in professional outlets, and so it was amazing to see you'd talked in depth about a number of them, and that you'd done a special on Self-Made Hero already, who's been one of my longtime publishers.
Yeah, I know that Self-Made Hero is going to be a publisher that you and I come back to again and again, but there are going to be other publishers that we'll primarily focus on in the months to come. I know that, IDW has that Eurocomic series, and I think that for our very first episode, we're slotted to do a review of one of those books. But what are some of the other publishers that you think we should deal with for the BD show?
Well, I think Cinebook, based out of the UK, has been doing some interesting work. It's mostly what's interesting about it to me is that it's mostly not contemporary and new releases. They're doing a lot of classic series, and they're making that available to the English reading public. Like, I think Persepolis set a certain precedent in the mid 2000s in the English language world, that like French comics were sort of indie and alternative, and it's true. There's been a really powerful force in indie French comics over the last 20 years, I'd say. But I think that people don't know that the mainstream of French comics are actually heroic fantasy, thriller, adventure, and humor. I mean, those are the three main genres, I think, that would, for them, the way that superheroes are for us. Mm-hmm. So it would, it's almost like Cinebook is doing some kind of strange cultural mission. But then there's also, Humanoids, Humanoids, which used to be tied to heavy metal, has an incredible stable of creators in their catalog. They're doing some good work, and I know I have some friends who translate for them. There's NBM is a big stalwart. They've always done certain very major French figures like Nicolas de Crécy and David B. I do a lot of work for Titan, which is doing a lot of the old reprinting or commissioning retranslations of the of science fiction classics from the 70s and 80s. And as well as some newer stuff, like Skydoll. There's a possibility that Fantagraphics may be doing more blotch. Top Shelf will be doing some Frederick Peters. So that's an early series, one in which you can sort of see Peters learning to draw over the course of 4 epic volumes, the far future science fiction road trip.
Drawn in quarterly?
No, that's Top Shelf.
No, I say, but there's also drawn in quarterly.
There's also drawn in quarterly. Yeah,
right?
they're one of the stalwarts, the great, the Fantagraphics and drawn in quarterly are two of the main, always have been two of the main publishers for European comics and translation.
Yeah, and smaller presses like Uncivilized and Conundrum out of Canada. So, it's interesting because when you and I first began talking about this possibility of doing a monthly show devoted to bande dessinée, I was thinking, there's probably just a handful of publishers that we would keep coming back to. But when you start thinking about it, and this is something kind of like you pointed out earlier, we have done a lot of French translated or books that have been translated from the French on the podcast by a variety of publishers, and I just don't think of that initially. But so we could turn to publishers like translations from Dark Horse and Image and others.
Yeah,
as well.
Dark Horse with their Moebius stuff. That hopefully that'll really take off. Yeah,
this fall we're gonna be there, dude.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's actually a really good time. It's a really good time for comics in translation, and that's not to mention French and Belgian publishers who are going direct to digital and releasing through Comixology. Titles in translation. So yeah, it's kind of a boom time. It's surprising how many titles are available.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have plenty to discuss in the months to come. So we hope that you guys listening to the podcast will come back and beginning in June, listen to our monthly BD series that Edward and I have. But, I said I did want to bring you on to introduce you to the listeners, but we should also introduce our conversation that we're about to hear with Jamie. I think this was a fun talk. We should point out that Jamie is living in Italy. I think she said, Milan?
Yeah.
And so every now and again, you may hear a little technical issue. We were bringing her in through Skype. But I think overall, despite a few technical issues here or there, it was a pretty clean conversation.
Oh, absolutely. I'm really glad I got to talk to Jamie. I think that's actually the longest conversation we've had. We've sort of run into each other at conferences, translators conferences before, so I'd always been aware of her work. But it was great to hear her open up and give her opinions both on translation itself as well as the specific books.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and start listening to that conversation. I'm pleased to be talking on the podcast with Jamie Richards and Edward Gauvin. Both of them are translators. Jamie has translated 2 recent books, Manuele Fiore's 5,000 kilometers per second and Igor's The Ukrainian and Russian Notebooks. And Edward has recently translated Johann Sfar's Pasquin and Bluch's Peplum. Guys, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Derek.
And, one of the reasons why I wanted to have both of you on the podcast is to inform not only our listeners, but also to educate me about what goes into a translation. Because from my experience, as Edward can well attest, I have tended to, unfortunately, see the translator as invisible whenever we have discussed comics in translation. And understanding that as a shortcoming, I've been thinking over the past few months, what is it that translators do, and what are some of the challenges when it comes to not just translating texts as a whole, but visual text? And so I guess that's maybe a way to begin, is to throw out to both of you, what are some of the challenges you have in translating comics?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry.
No.
Edward has a little bit more experience, but for me, it's been some of the challenges have had to do actually with research. Some of the comics I've done have involved a fair amount of research in fields I'm not familiar with. That doesn't necessarily apply only to comics translation, but finding the right sorts of registers or historical terms, foreignisms, that's been one of the challenges for some of my recent work.
Yeah, I guess I feel like it's a perennial question because, when people first hear you translating comics, they just think, fewer words, words in bubbles and boxes, right? I mean, do you find that, Jamie? Do you find that's generally true, that it just is about like having a lighter word count, or have you found that actually it's like that you have to do specific things like key translations to images sometimes, or even think about the images? Did the images affect your wording at all, like maybe in the revision stage or something like that?
Absolutely, I think so. But I think that comes out even more when the register is colloquial and there are conversations. So, whatever's happening in an image can help resolve. It can also help resolve, right, when you don't maybe understand exactly what's happening, right, as a translator. But, the Igor books, the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks are actually two separate books. They got published in English as a single volume, and they were actually the first full-length translations, comic translations that I did. And since then, I've started actually including the image in the document as I'm working on it, because I feel like with the Igor I didn't. This is sort of technical, right? But I just had a Word document, right, with the text only, and the images, from the original pages were kept separate. And I think that actually inhibited somehow my translation a little bit. Not keeping the image always present. So if you're working on a second or third draft, and maybe you forget the image for a second, right?
Right.
I'm not sure that's a good idea to ever forget the image.
Now, that's fascinating. So then what do you still work in a Word document now and then just copy like a screenshot of like a panel or the whole page, or?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Huh. That's fascinating. Yeah, no, I do think, you've already got the perennially invisible translator, so that when you move into a medium where words are generally or often considered subservient to the image, or even deliberately considered that way these days, because there's a sort of push for the image to take primacy, so comics can come into their own, so comics can be seen as a primarily visual medium, so they're not beholden to literature or literary standards, and all that. So that and then all that kind of stacks oddly against people whose field is primarily linguistic, like us. But I don't think it has to be. There has to be like a power relationship between words and images. I do think they people like I feel like theorists talk about multimodality these days instead of constraints, right? Like one being, forced to do something by the other or vice versa. I do think Jamie's point about register is really totally a Right. I think in general, like just as a sort of the kind of rule that you can always find exceptions to, my comics work has been a lot more colloquial than my prose work. That doesn't mean that for some reason also people think comics are full of wordplay or puns or something. That's not necessarily the case. But it is more colloquial. And sometimes one of the things I find myself adjusting is the difference between difference in register between dialogue and narration. Also, even when narration is from the point of view of one of the characters, I think there are and it comes out in tiny ways, but that's what translation seems to be about. Millions of tiny adjustments, right? Like just more contractions, fewer contractions, or like like sentence fragments, not sentence fragments, or the sort of the many ways you can colloquialize something.
Now, I'm curious, what languages do each of you primarily translate? Or which languages do you feel proficient enough in order to do those translations?
I translate from Italian almost exclusively, and that's mainly because I read in Italian, really. I also translate a little bit from Spanish, and I can work in Spanish, though I don't always pursue those projects because I'm less well-versed in Spanish language literatures, let's say, or Spanish comics. But I also have a Spanish graphic narrative coming out. So,
oh wow,
it's Spanish. Mm-hmm.
Which one is that, Jamie?
So it's called, I think they're going with this title in English, it's called Tropical Virus, but I think that they're keeping the sort of original in Spanish inversion in the title, so it makes me want to say Virus Tropical whenever I say it in that way. So Tropical Virus or Virus Tropical, by a Colombian Ecuadorian comics artist called Power Paula, and it's a sort of graphic Bildungsroman of sorts. Yeah. And
that's going to be translated into English?
Yes.
Oh, cool. Can you remember who the publisher is?
2D Cloud.
Oh, 2D Cloud. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's one of those smaller presses that I've discovered over the past couple of years that, once I notice them, I start recognizing more and more of their stuff out there. And this is just another occasion of that.
Yeah, it's a great book. So do look for it. But I think it'll be out in May or June of this year. So it's coming out.
Oh, wow.
I guess it's already May. What am I saying?
Awesome.
Maybe June.
Wow, so that's like 3 in a row there, because 5,000 kilometers per second came out last month, I believe, and then the Igort book came out just recently, and then you have, how do you pronounce his name? Power Paula? Power Paula?
Paula. It's
Paula.
A woman, actually.
Okay. Oh,
yeah.
her name. Okay. But that's one word, Power Paula.
I've seen it together and separately.
Okay.
So, yeah, Power Paula.
So, and Edward, I know that you work in French. Are there other languages that you translate in comics or otherwise?
No, I work in French only. I mean, I can speak kind of household Mandarin, but I can't read it well enough to be proficient. But Jamie, you came out of you studied translation, right? Or complet? Which one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, comparative literature.
So and you
Sorry,
go ahead. What were Spanish and Italian your two required languages, or did you have to have 3, or how did that work?
I did have to have 2 foreign languages. My other foreign language was actually French, but I didn't do very much work in it. And then my dissertation was Italian and English focused. So, yeah. And I also studied translation at University of Iowa. So,
okay. Do you feel that? Because I've never been in a translation workshop, or do you feel that the curriculum
prepared you well for a life of professional translation? Not so much the the getting jobs, et cetera, part, but so much just in terms of the actual practice part, or?
I think getting an MFA gives you the sort of space and opportunity to practice, and as well as workshopping. So in that sense, that was quite a while ago, but I would say so, that it's definitely a good entry point.
That's good to know.
To both the profession and, if you want to be more into translation studies academically.
Mm.
You haven't done translation studies at all?
I read a bit on my own, but I haven't formally studied French or translation at a university level. Just I'm sort of, but I hang around the scene so much that I kind of get conversant in certain, canonical articles and ideas, but like having just read stuff on my own, but no, not really.
I mean, maybe you would be more up on also what people are saying about comics translation, if there's any interest. I know people are doing more work on it.
Yeah, I think that's true. They are, especially from the European side. They're definitely looking into it. And delving into it historically, a lot of comics that I feel like there's a bunch of papers on translating Disney comics and all the in the 60s and 70s into various European languages, and the multiple versions and the various Disney house rules they had to play by, and things like that
Right. I mean, there's comics as the mass cultural phenomenon, and the floppies and all of the Disney and Asterix, and then there seems to be some distance between the discussion on the very popular forms of comics and maybe the more artistic or literary, graphic novel comics.
Now this
which have a shorter history, I think. Go ahead, Derek.
No, I was going to say this is interesting in that Jamie, what you just mentioned leads me to wonder. I mean, how often do you guys work in taking English language comics, primarily, I guess, by U.S. creators, and translating them into, let's say, Italian or French? Or is it primarily the direction going from the foreign language into English?
Yeah, that would be a never for me. But however, I do wind up in some unofficial capacity sometimes recommending English artists, creators, and books to French agents and creators and publishers. I'm not saying that it ever or even always or even ever results in anything, but I wind up. I do think, especially a lot of the foreign rights agents seem to work both ways, and so there, in that sense, there's a commerce. But I don't think I would translate into French if I don't think I would do that for professionally, at least.
I think that's the standard. Most people translate into their native language unless fully bilingual or or trying some kind of experiment, I guess. I've only translated it into English also.
Because I know that the U.S. market for say comics in translation. I mean, I would think that I'd like to think that it was fairly large, and I would also like to think that there's a lot of potential there. But I'm wondering, have either of you noticed over the past few years any kind of tendencies in the market, let's say, or publishers coming to you more frequently with the need for a translation of graphic narrative in some form or another?
I think that is a question for Edward. I've been doing comics only for a few years. But I think that the industry or the market is generally growing, as far as I know.
Yeah, Yeah, I think it's a largely small press driven market in terms of growth. I mean, I do think. I mean, I kind of got my start in the mid 2000s with the sort of the comics boom that kind of happened then when many major American publishers decided to open up their own comics imprints and didn't quite have enough domestic talent to fill their roster, or just plain didn't know what they were doing, and would commission things like adaptations of classics for want or lack of, really knowing anything better, or having been to SPX and checked things out, and also they would bring over more foreign titles as a result. And I think if you look at the big French incursions of French comics into the U.S., then you have like the Asterix Tintin classics. You have a little later you have heavy metal, which is a very influential aesthetic, and then in the early 2000s you have Persepolis, which gives French indie comics a name in the U.S. The other two, Asterix and Tintin and heavy metal, all being mainstream in some way, at least in France. So that I think that so people were looking at a lot of indie talent from France, indie talent that had really begun publishing in the 90s, often by forming artist collectives and just that published their own works. And these were people who amazingly enough could not land jobs or land gigs in the early 90s, and who in the 15 years from then until 2005 they became the dominant forces of French comics, and they permanently shifted the entire aesthetic of French comics to, I guess you could call it the left, but to the alternative side a bit. So it was sort of a successful revolution, but no, I'm getting off track though. But do I think more American publishers are doing it? Ash, honestly, I feel like my business these days is split between British publishers and American publishers pretty evenly. I feel like since the mid 2000s when I started doing comics, there was actually kind of a lull toward the end of the end of the aughts, and then some of my main clients would go through brief periods of being out of business, or they would get folded into other companies. Like Archaea is now a part of Boom, Top Shelf is now a part of IDW, and then at the same time the British indie comic scene starts taking off, and I think there's more fairs there now. There's more people interested in it. People are starting to be interested in the Academy as well. And so, I mean, 2D Cloud is a company that I only very recently, popped up on my radar. So, I mean, I think there are, just like in other areas like world literature or science fiction and fantasy or even crime, there's a lot of small presses that are driving, picking up foreign works and sort of, I don't see that much. I feel like my big corporate clients like First Second, which is part of Macmillan, are doing or Pantheon. It's very rare for them to pick up a French book these days.
So you think it's a little unusual for larger trade publishers like you mentioned Macmillan or Random House, which has Pantheon, to do these, even though Jamie's The Ukrainian and Russian Notebooks is a Simon & Schuster publication. You think that these are more a rarer case than otherwise?
Yeah, that's an interesting story, though, because there's a direct I see the woman who picked up Persepolis for Pantheon is also the woman who picked up the Ukrainian and Russian Notebooks for Simon & Schuster. And even though she's no longer at Simon & Schuster, she's an editor who, over the course of the last 10 years, at whatever publisher she's worked for, has managed to pick up at least one Euro comic. And usually they performed very poorly. I mean, with the exception of Persepolis, she went to Houghton Mifflin and picked up Blue Pills, which was Frederick Peters, the Swiss artist Frederick Peters' breakout novel, a breakout graphic novel, a memoir of living with a lover who had AIDS. It was his breakout work in Europe, but it did not at all break him in English. I mean, it sold like 400 copies and just sank like a stone. And I don't think Peters really had a reputation in English till Self-Made Hero picked him up and started doing Sandcastle, Pachyderm, where I jumped on, and then the Amma series. And now Top Shelf is going to be doing Lupus, another early science fiction black and white series, a 4-book series. So I mean, sometimes careers I think get stalled here with one bad book. I think like per David B's Epileptic here on the heels of Persepolis, but it was a really slow grower, and for a while there was just no other David B. At least in major outlets, like sure, Fantagraphics Moem had always done a couple stories here and there, and then NBM started picking up more David B. and David B. stock rose. But so I do think the Blue Pill stalled out Frederick Peters for a while. But then that same editor, after she left Houghton, convinced Karen Berger at Vertigo to do Marzi, which was a memoir of a little girl growing up in Poland, in communist Poland, which was a huge hit in France. And here also, not sure how well that sold, but she's consistently picked tasteful work from Europe. It just hasn't had, Pantheon has a real comics. It's kind of a comics powerhouse now in the way that none of these other publishers are or really know how to handle. Not Houghton, not Simon, and Vertigo's had all those weird personnel changes, right? So I don't know how much of that is. I'm not sure where to ascribe that necessarily, but let's say that it was true in the mid 2000s. It's true now that most large publishers, I think, really don't know how to handle things. And Pantheon generally doesn't debut people. Pantheon will poach artists and creators from smaller presses or bet on really sure things. Like very established thing. Yeah.
And that's interesting. And if we just stick with David B. as an example, this makes a lot of sense because the publishers who have been putting out his books recently, Self-Made Hero and Uncivilized, in addition to NBM. So those are smaller presses that are more specifically, if not exclusively, devoted to comics, handling those kind of translations. So that seems, from what you're saying, Edward, more the case than otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think if a small press does have a really huge, really oddly huge, I mean, even Persepolis was poached in the day from Fantagraphics. The Fantagraphics had already released the first 2, I believe, and then Pantheon not only took those, but then released the 4-volume set, right, or in one, the 4-volume omnibus. So like, this sounds like I'm really anti-Pantheon, which is not. It's not. I'm anti them only in the sense that they're just known to be poachers. But on the other hand, you can't beat the money and production value that they put into their books. I mean, it's a different class from NBM completely. I mean, Fantagraphics can give them a good run for their money, but just in terms of quality of the object, yeah.
Well, here's another question, and I want to direct this at you, Jamie. I wonder when you're given a text to translate, and it could be a comics text or it can be prose. How much research do you do in the author in order to understand their style and what they do? In other words, when you were given the project of Igor's Russian and Ukrainian and Russian notebooks, did you delve into Igor all of Igor's other works in order to get a sense of things? Is that necessary to look at their entire body of work?
I think it's a good idea to read as much as you can. I have not read all of Igor's work. I've read some of it. But, in some cases, like in the case of these books, I found myself replicating his research a little bit because, they're travel logs and they're testimonies. And he also cites historical documents, so I had some translations of translations actually to deal with. I befriended our Slavic studies librarian, to look up these documents from the secret police and, place names. And so this kind of research where I had to at least attain some modicum of mastery over the material I had to reproduce. So on the one hand, I think you research an author and figure out their style. I think also in this case, the style is a little bit different. Igor has mainly done fictional stories, right? I mean, his body of work ranges a little bit, and then he's gone and been doing these notebooks, right, which are sort of going in a different direction and sort of have a different tone. And there's also, the insertion of his own narration, his own experience, and then these sort of, replications of recorded interviews or testimonies. There are also documents from, Human Rights Watch. There are also literary quotes and some more obscure quotes. So, I did that kind of work for these books in particular. And then, in other cases where it's a work of fiction, I might, focus more on just reading the author's work as much as I can.
And do you feel the need as well, Edward, to delve into as much of that creator's body of work as possible? And I'm thinking, for instance, of Ludovic Debremé, when his recent book Renee, which you translated, came out earlier this year. So when you began translating Debremé, did you go back to read everything that he had done previous in order to set the stage for the works that you were translating?
Well, no, I didn't go back and read. Well, so I guess in this case, my answer is one of those pass the buck things of practical expediency. I think I did do more reading, more comprehensive reading when I was doing fewer comics, and now when the comics volume really ramped up, I really, but I mean, I think the lucky thing then was also I came to comics with a certain body of reading already, also as a fan. So like, if someone asked me to do a Trondheim, I'd read a bunch of Trondheim. I'm not that the Trondheims are really that much alike. He almost has several mini genres within his work, and so, with Ludovic, I definitely did go back and read Lucille when I worked on Renee, but there are definitely things in Lucille that I wish I could fix now, looking back at it, because I think that was a very early one for me, and the funny thing is, and then I have read Ludovic's novel. He wrote a prose novel as well, but sort of just out of curiosity, not really to inform anything.
Don't you feel like style manifests differently as well in comics as opposed to prose? Like it's somehow more in a dialectic between the image and the text? Because I feel like also even just in some cases it can be a sense of character that comes out that you're working with, to figure out the style, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do think there's. I mean, when I was asking in the beginning about keying text to image, I can think of specific examples where I feel like the face or the posture of the person in the panel would affect whether it was in an exclamation or a question or the sort of the tenor of the statement, I guess. I guess these days I don't do that much auxiliary reading. Or sometimes what I rely on is if I'm doing a series, I try to work really fast so that I'm ahead of the series curve and can go back and fix things if necessary.
Now, we've talked about the work that you guys do in, primarily working with one language, translating that into to English. I was thinking, Edward, about that talk that you gave the other month at the University of Florida's Comics Conference, which, that's where you and I met in person. We had met each other via email before that. You gave your keynote talk on the challenges of onomatopoeia. And I'm thinking about that because one of the unique aspects of comics when it comes to a translator is that many times language, text, becomes a part of the art. So I remember your talk was devoted to, what do you do in terms of translating onomatopoeia? I mean, there's the challenge of it being onomatopoeia and providing, issues of translation. But if those exclamations or those sound effects become a part of the art itself, then how do you deal with that as a translator? And in reading the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks, Jamie, I was thinking of something similar because there are many instances where Igor's art includes Russian words. In other words, you would have in a panel someone speaking something where the sound coming out of their mouths is Russian, and it's not in like a speech balloon or a narration box overhead. In other words, the text becomes a part of the art. Now, that's not translated, but did you find that a particular challenge in working with the Igor text?
Well, it's nice to know what those things mean. I think that Igor is also drawing on different visual traditions, constructivism and Rodchenko, and Cyrillic as in its visual aspect, typography. And so I think usually the words that are there are sort of either you can make them out maybe, or it's something like radiation, or it's something that is being discussed more, or death, or something that is being discussed in the section in such a way that it's integrated into the image as a sort of extra background that you can either, understand what the word means or not. But and so I think that that was something I sort of absorbed, but didn't necessarily pay attention to, because and in other cases too, when there are onomatopoeia that are part of the image, I haven't seen them be changed. I don't know if anyone ever changes the images.
And actually, I have a couple of examples in mind, and this is in the Ukrainian part of the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks. This is toward the end in that section on the land. And I'm looking at pages 146 and 147. Now, the bottom of page 147, Jamie, there is, and I'm assuming that is thunder, Broan, B-R-O-A-N, because the narrator is speaking about a storm coming. And so I'm assuming that that's an example of onomatopoeia. But if you look at the very top of page 146, this is an example of someone yelling out something. And so those words are in Russian. That's retained. The Russian is retained. And so there's no translation because the words themselves are a part of the art. I'm not even sure what that means in Russian, the words coming out of that character's mouth. What is that?
I'm assuming it means sadness, right? Because it's surrounded by the word sadness in tiny print. But I don't know for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's French in the background as well. I actually don't know what that word means.
The thing is, so this is when I was talking about, and one of my caveats at the beginning of my talk on onomatopoeia was that I was treating it in a kind of ideal case, because a lot of times people either don't care enough to change it,
it's impractical to change it. Like, I'm guessing that the Broen would be very difficult to change because it would involve Igor redrawing that whole panel, you know. And then
what's interesting too is, like, I mean, he's an Italian artist, right? So it's not, you know, something that an Italian reader has access to, right? So there's also that layer,
right?
So it's already meant to be. Go on.
No, and then, or sometimes it's just they don't have money or the personnel or the know-how to do it. But I have worked on. I find it's probably more like a 35-65 split, where 35% of the time I have worked on, you know, because things where it's easier to change the sound effects, and they do. And it's not just for indie comics; it's also for mainstream ones. I think in the mainstream ones, it's becoming increasingly easier because there's digital lettering, and digital lettering will just layer on the sound effect rather than having it be an integrally drawn part of the panel. So you can remove it, you know, and you can put something approximate on it. And sometimes it looks approximate, but you know, they take care to match the font the best they can. And then in just really only one instance, I've had it where where the artist has participated in redoing, relettering, redrawing sound effects, and it was a very special case, and it happened because of the insistence of the writer, and it, you know, and it worked great. But yeah, I was. Were you even given the option, Jamie, in this of like providing sound effect translations?
Not here, and I think calling them sound effects kind of brings up the idea that I think here they're really visual effects more than onomatopoeia or sound effects per se. So, you know, so not in this case.
Yeah, no, I mean, whether that it brings there's a lot of issues involved, like the design aspects of the lettering and the font, and also. And when you're talking about languages, it's like, I think another issue is, I mean, I think there's been a bunch of comic scholarship that's focused on the diegetic versus non-diegetic sound in comics. And part of it is like, so who is this sound effect really for, right? Is there anyone in the panel or the surrounding panels to hear it? Or is it primarily directed at the reader? And if it's directed at the reader, should it be in the language that, I mean, if you did like a really stupid thought experiment, right, where like some guy goes to a foreign country in a comic, and so all the speech in the speech balloons is now in a foreign language. But if a bus goes by, should that bus sound different? Because buses do actually sound different from right. Country to country. Or should it? But then if a cat meows, should it meow be the same? Because should it meow in his onomatopoeia rather than someone else's? You know, like, so then, I mean, it's not. This is not something that's legislated even in monolingual comics, but it's just something that I guess I think about a lot, because I do try to change them because I'm very aware. I find it somewhat disruptive of the reading experience when I see something that either is clearly a foreign sound effect or visual effect attached to a recognizable action, or worse yet, a foreign word that kind of looks like one of our words that shouldn't be there, right? Right, and so like those are all those. I mean, I don't think they really bother. I don't think they chuck you out of the book, right? I just think that's something that gets to me. And just one more thing though is I did work, because I should have thought of this when you were asking earlier about going from other languages. Is I did work on a series, a trilogy. Was it 3? It was either 3 or 4 books, but it came out as one book in English called A Chinese Life, and for Self-Made Hero, and it was the memoir of a Chinese editorial cartoonist through much of the 20th century, but it was written by a Frenchman, in that the Frenchman was there and living in China, met this guy, interviewed him in what I believe to be mostly Chinese, but then wrote this script in French that the editorial cartoonist then provided the illustrations for, was kind of a dirty word in comics, but provided the art for. And unlike in some manga where I'm not sure of the actual ratio in manga, but I believe sometimes I've just seen people pick on the translations of the poor visual integration of translations of sound effects in manga. And so I gather that at least in some manga, these things are translated. But in this book, you had a lot of onomatopoeia in Chinese characters, and none of it could remotely be. It was so deeply embedded in the art, like it would weave around people's faces and heads, and so like I did take great pains to figure out exactly what each of these things were, and it was at a time just so I could provide footnotes, though they wound up using none of the footnotes. And I guess what I didn't like about that is that I didn't care that they didn't use my footnotes. I just thought that if you leave it, there's already kind of this unfortunate Western tendency to look at ideograms and sort of assign them more pictorial meaning than they might possess. So right. You it's kind of like people who get like nonsense Chinese tattooed on their bodies or something, so it's like, so then you have this thing that does have a lexical content, but it's been completely reduced to a pictogram because you can't access that content, right? And so weirdly enough, I was just 2 weeks ago asked to evaluate a sort of sequel to these books that was directly written by the Chinese editorial cartoonist and then translated into French. And this time they had so this book only exists in French so far. It doesn't have an English edition. The Self-Made Hero is wondering whether they should do it. They wanted me to look it over. But the new French editions are footnoted down. Like every last sound effect gets footnoted, or they stick in French sound effects in Roman alphabet among the digitally, like kind of among the Chinese ideogram sound effects floating in midair. So it's weirdly cacophonous. And clearly there's no font matching. There's no attempt at font matching going on, right? So like, cause there is a such thing as Chinese font matching. It's very subtle, but I remember reading an article that was talking when I was researching the onomatopoeia talk. It was an article that was talking about the different fonts they went through to kind of give Chinese ideograms a little bit of serif, so they could make the headline for the Chinese edition of the New York Times, International Herald Tribune. Like things like that. Like there is font matching is possible, but they didn't do it in this case, and it looks kind of weird. And anyway, that was a long aside, but
well, I think weird cacophony is is a good phrase for some of these kind of things that can happen.
Huh. Well,
yours as well.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, no, you guys are using manga as an example here. I know that it's not uncommon in manga to, leave the sound effects in the original Japanese because more times than not, that becomes a part of the art itself. But then in the back, you'll find a glossary that basically translate what those effects are. And sometimes that can get quite extensive, right? So that the section at the very end that translates the sound effects can go on for pages and pages and pages. And so the reader can then choose to, as he or she is reading, to keep turning back to see what those sound effects are or not, if it disrupts his or her reading experience. Now, I'm wondering, in the kind of translation work that you guys do, if either of you have done anything like that, specifically when it comes to comics and translation. I mean, have you done work where the sound in one form or another is so much a part of the art that you need to retain the original language and then include some kind of endnote that translates or explains what those things are?
Well, they could well have turned my footnotes into endnotes for A Chinese Life, but they didn't. I think the only thing they retained for endnotes / footnotes was my translations of like store names and placards and banners and things like that. Because I worked with my mom. a lot to make sure I was getting across all the Chinese in that book as well as the French. But that's really the only case where it's been that. That's only the. I feel like, and in the case in Weapons of Mass Diplomacy, where the artist redrew, Christophe Blanc redrew a lot of the sound effects. He made sure to match his own previous art, so same colors, same. If it was a 3D letter, same 3D letter. Like he even though the shape of the letters was different, there are four very different looking letters, VLON versus DOOM with umlauts, but it was, the colors were all the colors and shapes, and he did.
Yeah, I mean, I think this also maybe has to do with sometimes what publishers might want. As a translator, I've never necessarily felt like it was my place to intervene in the content of the images. But also, I mean, doing a language like Italian, a lot of times the sound effects might not be so far off, as they might be from, in different languages. But I've never really thought about the possibility of having the images changed, or have had editors, suggest it either.
Well, this raises another question I had for you guys, and that is, how closely do you work with the publisher or the editor versus how closely do you work with the artists themselves? So, for instance, Jamie, I mean, how closely did you communicate with Igor and, for example, Edward, with you and Bluch in doing the translations that you guys did?
I asked some questions, of course, but I don't, I wouldn't say I worked that closely. And so far, with the few authors I've worked with, I haven't, engaged with most of them that much. And I don't know if you've found this too, Edward. I feel like they're not as interested in translation. That's to, I mean, not to, make a huge generalization, but, compared to, prose authors or something like that. So I've asked some questions to Igor and some different authors. But that's about it. Clarifications or things like that.
Do you find that your prose authors are intensely interested in translation?
No, I just find more of a range where some people want to, really work with you and sit there with you, and that. So I was wondering if you found that as well, because you've done a few more comics than I have.
Yeah, I would say, honestly, with comics, like 70% of the time, I'm not in touch with the creators. But that's because I do a lot of genre comics, and I think I don't have many problems with them. And the creators are maybe even kind of distanced from them themselves, because they kind of, the series where they churn out titles, and they're just kind of doing it for, they have a very professional relationship with the publisher, and then I'm just kind of like another part of a machine. I think in the early days of my translation career, I was actively afraid to ask authors questions because I didn't want to come across as someone who didn't know my job. And I think once I got over that, I was a much happier person. No, I did. But I think, having worked on the range of comics that I have, though, I feel like it is kind of like you said, Jamie, for prose, though. There are people who are interested. There are people who aren't. I do tend to find the writer-artists generally less interested than the writer-writers, because there's lots of times when, there's just less
of a fixation on the texture of words.
Yeah. But that's not always true. I mean, Ludovic de Berme is someone who is very interested and someone who, will reply at length and has also replied at length to critics of his own work. But Bluch was someone who was totally uninterested, who I do actually think of as more of a cartoonist than a wordsmith or a storyteller, which is not to say, he actually has a really neat feel for words. It doesn't come across in Peplum so much as in like some of his other books, but I do think the best reviews of Peplum, not just the positive reviews, but I mean the reviews that have actually seemed to really connected with the book, are people who appreciate the fact that he's an amazingly expressive draftsman, and in several styles. And I feel like maybe that's where his interest resides too. Is his word choices are always really specific and often a bit challenging, both in Peplum and in So Long Silver Screen, the previous book of his I did. But he's not someone who like won't even write back when you try to interview him, who's been famously touchy about publicity. So like, maybe he's not the best example because he's just kind of tired of that now, I think. But there have been writers, like writer artist teams, where the writer was a little bit more involved. But I also think you want to manage their involvement, because it's great when the people who have it's great when the people who are really good at English get involved, and it's kind of bad when the people who have okay English get involved, and then people with no English generally don't get that involved. So.
Well, I think that Peplum is an interesting case, Edward, because in reading that, and it's a great book, but there are these long stretches that are wordless. In other words, the story is carried solely by the art. And so I'm wondering if maybe Bluch was less concerned with the translation, because for him and the way that he tells stories in comics, it's the art that really tells what's going on much more so than any text that he would insert. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that's part of it, definitely. But the other part is that it's a 25-year-old book for him, maybe even more, so it's, or 20-year-old book for him. So like, I'm sure he's just over it to some extent.
That's passé for him now.
Well, yeah, because he's an artist who's taking great pains to reinvent himself with almost every book. Like, stylistically, he's really been all over the map, and just so like I think for someone like that who's so protean, maybe revisiting old work is not the key to unlocking his mind or participation.
Can I ask a question about Peplum too? Because so your English in that is sort of archaic, right? And is that also the case for the French?
Yeah, it's interesting because the French, it's a piecemeal French text, right? Like, it's got direct quotations from a French translation of Shakespeare, a famous but clunky French translation of Shakespeare. It's got quotations from a translation into French of Petronius' Satyricon, and it's got places where he's kind of taken lines from the Satyricon and then rewritten them himself. So I do think also I got edited more on that translation than I usually do, which is to say I usually don't get edited at all, which is a sad state of affairs that I would love to change. But because I always appreciate a good edit, an informed edit. So in this case, there's a lot of editorial wrangling about exactly that, about register. About keeping register consistent, but also like Bluch has parts that are in it that are like, he uses modern slang in it too. He uses bits of like, there are like, deliberately off key things in it. If you take the basic key as being archaic and a little elevated diction wise, he has deliberately off key things in it. So like, I think for me, it was a battle between harmonizing everything and not harmonizing it too much, letting it still be jangly, I guess.
One of the things I noticed emotionally in reading the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks is just how damn depressing it is. As I was going through it, the Ukrainian and the Russian sections, it's just a really sad state of affairs. And I'm wondering, though, when you guys do translations, how invested are you, or how, not invested, that's the wrong word, how involved are you in the narrative, in the story that's being told as you're doing the translation? In other words, is it easy to get caught up in the story, or do you maintain a distance? And I guess specifically, Jamie, when you were translating the Igor, were you able to keep enough distance to where all of these really sad and disheartening stories that Igor recounts didn't affect you?
That's sort of an interesting question, right? I think that actually rereading it is sort of more affecting than translating it, because even, if you're working with it more closely than when you're reading it, maybe you're working more slowly and it sort of gets pieced apart. So I don't know if I felt, it's some harrowing material, but I saw it as, also, it was a great learning experience. I learned a lot doing it. So I sort of appreciated it more than I was, emotionally invested in it per se as a translator, I guess. I think it's harder to read than it is to translate, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, difficult to read or more challenging to read in that, trying to accept it and come to terms with it, I think. I know just a little bit about Russian or Soviet history, but one of the things I would strongly encourage our listeners to do, if they want to know, quite a bit more about the history of Russia, of the Ukraine area, of the Soviet Union, of communism in the 20th century, they would do well to read this book. And for instance, I did not know the story behind, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher her name, Anna Politkovskaya, who was the journalist,
the reporter,
yes, yeah. Who was murdered in, when was it, 2006, and so reading the Russian half of the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks was really an eye opener, and frustrating, maddening, depressing, all of that wrapped into one.
Her books are great too. Anna Politkovskaya. The Russian notebooks are interesting. I mean, he's sort of telling, this Russian story through really the war in Chechnya, and sort of the lack of freedom of press, and the assassination, the sort of unresolved assassination of, Anna Politkovskaya, who continued reporting on these horrible atrocities and human rights abuses. And she's emblematic, right? But, the other, I think he also wants to suggest that this is still the case. This is an ongoing problem. I think it's sort of a call to awareness, at least, for sure.
When you say her writing's great, it's been widely translated into English?
She has books translated. I don't know if it's all of them, but she has been translated. And
did you have to consult them for the Russian notebooks, or not have to, but or were they quoted in them, or?
I'm trying to remember. I know
there are quotations from within, but I don't remember if they're from her stuff or from other stuff about her.
One or two that are from her books, and then there are some other quotations that are directly from the newspaper. One of the newspapers she worked for, whether or not she wrote the article or not. So, and sometimes I track that stuff down a little bit. But she does have books published, I think, sort of in the same tenor as the recent Nobel Prize winner as well.
when I read in English, I'm actually not the hugest fan of page turners, but but because of the large number of genre comics I do find that if there is a compelling plot, it makes the translation go a lot faster, especially since I don't read the books before I start working on them. And it's kind of like, in my head, it's like watching slow TV, in that like I kind of TV where you understand the dialogue as you render it into English. But the only translation experience I do think, and it is affecting on that emotional level. Like, I do feel like sometimes if something hard hitting happens, I will like sit up and take notice. It is still at some remove, but I do notice. Whereas my most vivid memory of something actually viscerally affecting me was I translated a screenplay of Hellraiser once by one of the guy who did Martyrs, Pascal Laugier, and like it was just so disgusting, and it was so graphically disgusting, and there's so many details of like disembowelment and flaying and etc. And I remember just having to put down my dinner and not I don't know. But anyway.
I want to come back to, as a way of wrapping up, a topic that I broached at the very beginning of this conversation, and that is, when I referred to translations as kind of a silent act, for my own part, unfortunately, it was all too easy for me to read one of the books that you guys have translated without even thinking about the act of translation. But I'm curious what your thoughts as translators are on your efforts. I mean, do you feel that readers, both common readers and critical readers, are aware of and appreciative of everything that goes into translating a comic?
The invisible translator. I don't know. I think that, it's nice if readers or critics appreciate, that the language in a translation comes from the translator. Is the translator's language, is the target language, and appreciates it as such, right? I mean, I think even paying attention to the language to some extent, even if you're not talking about translation, at least points to the translation, right? So, sometimes people focus on plot, or depends maybe on the length of a review or what people are saying, but that an attention to the language is attention to the translation.
Yeah, I think the paradigm of invisibility is an older one, and you'll still find translators today who talk about their ideal being like, oh, you didn't notice my work, then I did a good job. But I feel like that's actually fewer and farther between. It tends to be, I find it tends to be older translators who say something like that, and that the younger ones are just trying to not bring themselves into the spotlight, but just trying to raise awareness about a process. It's kind of the same way that, like people used to be like, oh, all adaptations are worse than the original, but now people are aware of the constraints that can go into adapting something to the big screen or to the or to TV. And so the more they know about the constraints and the process, the more they appreciate how you might have found ways around or to negotiate those constraints, to negotiate that process. And I feel like that's what translators maybe are trying for, is just to get people a little more aware of the fact that it's not transparent, it's constructed, and maybe that's a little more difficult in something that's considered primarily a visual medium. But I do think some people, like maybe because they're translators, have always been really aware of this. I remember speaking to Kim Thompson, the late Kim Thompson of Fantagraphics, where he would do all the translations because he was rumored to, speak 11 languages or something. And he and at the time it was because I had contacted him because I thought, I was interested in doing David B. It was very early. It was like I had barely begun translating. I didn't realize. And at the time he was the only one doing David B. and Louis Trondheim. And he basically said no, because I want to be I want to be in control of their voices. So he identified the idea that there is, at least to his mind, there was such thing as consistency of voice in a foreign language, kind of like the way that there's one guy who dubs all of Bruce Willis in France. So everyone knows, if Bruce Willis speaks in a different voice in a dub movie, that it feels weird. So then, like, he had a. I mean, there will necessarily be a bigger array, sort of a. It's hard to. It's a little more different than with a pure prose author, because David B's visual style is also so unmistakable. But the idea that there was even something, unmistakable about his writing, I think it's not completely absent from people who like and are deeply immersed in comics. So I don't know if that's the answer that covers all the bases of the original question, which was pretty complicated, I think. Yeah.
Well, and maybe in asking the question, I am betraying some of, I guess, my reading proclivities, because it seems to me that up until recently, when Edward, you helped to bring it to my attention, I wasn't as aware and didn't really pay attention to the translator and his or her efforts in terms of the comics that I read, especially when compared to prose translations. And an example of this is a way of alluding to earlier work of yours, Jamie. When I read Marco Onardo's superhero comics, myths, ethics, and narrative strategies, in a review that I wrote for the Comics Alternative, I did note that the translation made this a wonderful critical text. And when I noted that, I had in mind Thierry Grunstein's first book in English, The System of Comics. And I think one of the things that made that book, as brilliant as it is in terms of the content, so painful to read for both me and many other critics is the problem of translation. Now, part of the problem may be just the writing style of Grunstein.
He's a stuffy writer. Oh my God. Sorry, go ahead.
Many academics love to contort language, whether they admit it or not. I mean, they have a proclivity to do that. But I think a good translation would take some of that awkwardness, that critical awkwardness, the academies, and make it a little more palatable. And one of the things I really enjoyed with superhero comics is Jamie's way of making it so damn readable. And I was really pleased today when I was going to your website, Jamie, to see that you had actually alluded to my review of the Ornato book.
I did. Well, because especially with an academic book, translation might not get talked about. So thank you for that mention.
Because I think that was an important point with the superhero comics text. So I'm glad to be blurbed. So thank you as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are different definitions of a good translation, right? So with Marco Onardo's book, I think some of that is already present in the Italian, because that book was meant to be a sort of crossover, scholarly, but for general audiences interested in comics, sort of text. In fact, the Italian publisher is a comics publisher, but isn't like an academic, only going straight to the libraries publisher. So I think part of that was in the book. Was in the book already. Readability.
Jamie, could I ask for Igor? I assume that the lettering they use, because there's a couple fonts in the book, but primarily the narration lettering, which is the lettering that's kind of on the cover for the subtitle and his name, as opposed to the speech balloon lettering, which is a little different. That's just that's the same as in. That's the computer font that's been made out of his hand lettering. Is that correct? Is that the same font that they use in the French and Italian editions, or just the Italian, or is it a totally different font and I'm wrong?
I haven't actually seen the French edition, but I do know that there's some standardization. So I think that it would be the same, and that is Igor's handwriting, actually.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, because that seems to be the standard these days, is to make a computer font out of the artist's original handwriting and then use that. The publishers pass that, from one to the other to use. But like, I mean, there are exceptions, right? With Pasquin and the Spar, they had to get an American letterer to redraw an imitation of the cursive script, but they used the computer font for the print script. But I guess I just brought it up because I do think it is something that has to do with the visual aspect of comics too, which is again the idea of font matching, which is when I feel like maybe certain infelicities or less than felicities of translation could maybe sneak by a little easier if we feel that the font is the same as, or the font matches the images well. And I don't think that's something that's true about prose, right? Because if you pick up a prose book, you don't care that if it's A, in the same font as the original, or B, in any font at all, as long as it's a pleasant reading experience. It's a readable font. But I do think that with comics, like if it looks, let's say you are aware of the fact that it's a translation, but only dimly, but then you see something that you see lettering that really like does not look right. Then I can come up with a couple examples where that's happened. Unfortunately, with Words Without Borders, because publishing snafus or just not supplying the font or artists refusing to do any relettering because the Words Without Borders has a limited budget. So you get things that look really wonky, like someone pasted in a computer font over. And I think that actually makes the translatedness stick out in a bad way for comics. I mean, it's kind of like Derek. You had a student, right, named Shay Hannum who's contributed to your site and your blog and also writes on comics, and he wrote a piece on lettering that I liked in the back of a recent issue of Shudder, a comic. It was mostly about John Workman, who's a very famous letterer, but Shay brings up the idea that lettering is an invisible practice, and it only draws attention when there's something wrong. And I do think that's also true with translation, right? I mean, or maybe that's the curse of all so-called invisible practices, is that when there's something wonky, then people get upset. People notice and people point at it. Right? And I mean, like Kurt Zia, the Nobel Prize winner, like every single one of his reviews of a translation for the New York Review of Books will end with a paragraph where he goes and nitpicks either errors or things he thinks could have been smoother, and it's almost kind of comical because it's like this clockwork little, oh yes, and ticks off a checklist.
I was thinking about lettering a little bit, but just right, the difference between lettering in most comics reflecting being humanized, right? So not a standardized font that anybody could use, but right. So somehow seeming more like a direct sort of communication, like you're being written to, or that maybe some proximity to the artist or author, that lends a certain immediacy or authenticity that, right, within the image that isn't part of, regular fonts in prose books.
Yeah, I like that being written to idea, or the idea of a direct address.
Well, Jamie and Edward, I want to thank the two of you for the conversation today. Let's hope that the practice of translation in comics is invisible no more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. Well, that was terrific. I'm really glad Jamie could join us from faraway Milan. Yeah, and no, it's really great to hear her talk about her process and talk about, it's I don't get to compare notes with other comics translators very often either. So it was great to hear, things she does differently, like, putting the images into the Word document and just to sort of remind herself of the images. That might be something I'm going to start to try.
Oh, well, good. So maybe one of the results of this conversation is some insights into your workflow.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And I think it was great to have her on, and also you as well, in that both of you have 2 books that have come out just recently. So, obviously, not only is it fresh in your mind, but it's fresh in my mind as well, having read these books. So, again, Edward, thank you for being a part of that conversation, and I look forward to having you part of the Comics Alternative in the months to come.
Oh, no, I'm looking forward to that a lot. We're going to kick butt and take names.
That's right. And if you want to
we're
find,
all out of bubblegum.
That's right. If you want to find comics that kick butt and take names, then you would do well to go to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. You're going to find unbelievable specials every single time you visit. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this conversation with the 2 translators. If you go to the Comics Alternative website, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe, which is a really easy program to use. Or you can call us old school over the telephone. The phone number is 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. You can contact us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at derek@comicsalternative.com. And pretty soon you can email Edward directly at, you guessed it, edward@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over the social media sphere, such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. You can also get us on Spotify, and if you're an Android user, Google Play Music. But you can still find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's by going to the website, comicsalternative.com. So this was a great conversation, Edward, and I look forward to talking with you about many more comics in the months to come.
And I as well.
And until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward.
We'll see you later.